The Kremlin is rapidly losing its air superiority.
The Russian army has virtually run out of air-launched missiles.
I don't even know if I should say this or not, but I'll tell you anyway.
The main intelligence directorate of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense has published information that Russian enterprises involved in the production of Kh-59 and Kh-69 missiles are experiencing serious difficulties due to the sanctions imposed on Russia.
In particular, 50 out of 116 companies are unable to deliver products for the production of these missiles on time.
Thousands of electronic components that are supposed to
improve lives and serve development.
The aggressors are turning them into tools for killing.
Their weapons depend on foreign components. Without them, they cannot continue to wage war, occupy, and kill. The production of missiles and other high-tech military equipment in the Russian Federation relies precisely on intermediaries who operate through front companies. And it seems that, for the Kremlin, this scheme has finally come to an end.
Without high-precision Western components, the military-industrial complex of the aggressor country is experiencing a colossal shortage.
As a result, the occupiers have effectively lost all their stockpiles of medium-range air-launched missiles.
The Russian defense industry depends on Western technologies.
This concerns not only the components used during the assembly of key units, but first and foremost, the production process itself.
The Russian defense industry is dependent in the area of computer numerical control, or CNC technology, which is crucial. Without software and the components themselves, almost 40% of Russian companies involved in the production of Kh-59 and Kh-69 class missiles are forced to shut down production, or at the very least go on extended forced breaks.
This is according to the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine.
This, in turn, leads to a catastrophic shortage of medium-range missiles in the enemy's arsenal, a shortage that is unlikely to be replenished, military experts explain.
Production will be slower, it will be more expensive, and possibly of lower quality, because it is impossible to guarantee what kind of parts will be used.
At first, the Kremlin wanted to replace Western components with Chinese ones. Fortunately, Putin is still on friendly terms with China. However, friendship is one thing, but business is business.
Chinese companies are wary of falling under new Western and especially American sanctions.
And they refuse to supply Russia en masse with the goods needed for its military-industrial complex.
It is no coincidence that there has been a redirection, a reorientation toward the Chinese market.
In other words, they are trying to replace Western technological equipment with cheaper Chinese-made copies.
But even in this case, the Russian Federation has faced the fact that China has imposed a ban on the supply of dual-use goods.
First and foremost, this affects the Russian military-industrial complex.
Therefore, we can say that at this point, Russia is facing truly critical issues.
Issues regarding the ability to implement a program for creating modern weapon systems.
The acute shortage of components for the Russian military-industrial complex has even led to so-called missile cannibalism. This is when old systems from warehouses and museums are dismantled and their parts are used to cobble together new missiles by hand.
They are churning out new missiles this way.
However, even this is only a temporary measure.
The Kremlin has virtually run out of both old Soviet missile engines and components for guidance systems.
As a result, the Russian military-industrial complex has actively started replacing its own high-precision weapons, such as the Kh-59 and Kh-69 missiles, with cheaper and sometimes frankly makeshift means of attack.
These include the Danum and Banderol missiles.
The latter is a weapon with a cruising speed within 600 kilometers and a flight range of less than 200.
And with virtually zero accuracy.
Due to the lack of those very Western components, these weapons are almost entirely devoid of guidance systems.
As for the Danum, the situation for the occupiers is even worse.
In fact, it is essentially
an aerial target, not some new product created from scratch.
Hence the catastrophically low effectiveness. However, lacking anything better, the Kremlin makes do with what it has and is ramping up mass production of at least this kind of weapon. Meanwhile, as analysts explain, our defenders are already preparing to counter these new Russian challenges and are testing cheaper types of weapons for destruction, to take out Russian parcels even as they approach.
Urgent!
A revolution in warfare! Ukraine has launched an attack on Russia.
The first video of the Flamingo super missile launch.
Friendship has been blown up.
A real disaster at such a crucial oil pipeline for the Kremlin.
And for the enemy, the SBU is going on the offensive.
All the details coming up.
Flamingo in action.
Footage of the new cruise missile in use has appeared online.
When developing the missile, engineers focused on three main factors:
flight range, warhead power, and deployment speed before launch.
In any case, these missiles will undergo modifications. I want to believe that this year we'll be able to reach at least 70-80 units per month.
And regarding the 3,000-kilometer range, I wouldn't look at it that way. I think it's actually more. Those are just PR numbers.
For us, 1,000 is already more than enough, believe me.
Within a 3,000-kilometer radius, there are a huge number of Russian targets that need to be reached.
Meanwhile, while the missiles are still in production, the Ukrainian armed forces are successfully striking targets on the aggressor's territory using other means.
Unmanned systems forces struck the Nikolskaya oil pumping station in the Tambov region.
As a result, oil pumping through the main Druzhba pipeline was completely halted.
About 10 explosions also thundered in the sky over Volgograd.
A fire broke out again at the oil refinery.
Well, somewhere it fell, somewhere.
Here's another one.
I don't know if it was visible if I caught it.
The Volgograd oil refinery is one of the 10 largest in Russia and is considered a key fuel producer in the Southern Federal District.
But thanks to the good drones, oil processing at the Volgograd refinery was successfully halted, at least until mid-September.
Also due to drone strikes, the Syzran oil refinery in the Samara region has halted production.
Apparently, we are seeing the first results of months-long efforts, months-long campaigns.
This is the rise in prices at gas station signs. This is
the disappearance of fuel from sale and sales only by coupons.
So far, this only affects the DPR, all its entities, it affects Crimea, and it affects certain regions of the Chechen Republic.
But in principle, this is a good sign. It shows that we are on the right track and need to keep going.
And while Russia is burning and ablaze, Ukraine is preparing a $100 billion arms deal with the United States.
Kyiv may acquire American weapons financed by Europe in order to obtain security guarantees from the US after a peace agreement with Russia.
Additionally, Kyiv and Washington may sign a $50 billion agreement for drone production with Ukrainian companies.
Everything was conceptual, very attractive.
First and foremost, it was aimed at the donor itself for Trump.
It was necessary.
A, to hook him, B, to keep him within Ukraine's sphere of interest.
In other words, what the Russian Federation did not get was a split among Ukraine's allies.
First, and it did not get the American leader into its bloody hands as an ally who, together with Russia, would pressure Ukraine so that it would be Zelensky who stops this war.
Well, we know by what means.
Even if this is only a prospect, it is already happening now.
Members of the coalition of the Resolute have declared their readiness to deploy deterrence forces in Ukraine after the war ends.
According to Volodymyr Zelensky, the plan is to involve about 30 countries, but their commitments will differ.
Some may consider the issue of military presence, while others will provide intelligence and other support.
There is no desire to send their own troops.
After the war ends, after a peace treaty is signed, of course.
There will be a few more willing participants. Why?
Because this will already be within the framework of a concluded peace treaty with a 99.9% probability under the auspices of the UN. When the UN Security Council convenes and votes on the necessity of sending a peacekeeping contingent to Ukraine and determines the number of troops.
Meanwhile, on the front, the Ukrainian armed forces have advanced.
Over the past 2 weeks, the defense forces have cleared a number of settlements in the Donetsk region and inflicted losses on the enemy. Significant losses in manpower and equipment.
And there are fewer and fewer people willing to fight for Putin's army.
In Russia, the rate of recruiting new soldiers for the war against Ukraine has dropped significantly.
In the second quarter of 2025, the number of Russians who signed contracts with the Ministry of Defense was the lowest in the past 2 years.
If we proceed from the premise that this is the case throughout the entire territory of the Russian Federation, then this is a very clear signal, which most likely means several things.
First, that the enthusiasts of the Russian world have run out. And at first, the marginalized people who were willing to go for free have run out. And then those who were ready to go for money have also run out.
Anything at all.
In other words, that segment of the population has disappeared.
And, apparently, we are coming to the point where Russia is already running out of money specifically to buy Russian meat for the Russian army.
Only in Russia, of course, will they skillfully hide this and claim that there are millions ready to die for Putin.
Millions of people.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
The horror that the Kremlin is hiding. While Russian propaganda feeds its people fairy tales, Russian losses at the front are 3 times higher than those of the Ukrainian armed forces. Putin's army is in agony. Where is the bloody meat grinder taking place, and how long can the Kremlin keep hiding these horrifying numbers? All this and more coming up.
Russia has broken through the Ukrainian defense line. The command reassures the public, saying it's just a few sabotage and reconnaissance groups. Western analysts are already speculating about what the loss of the entire Donetsk region could mean. Meanwhile, Ukraine has launched a counteroffensive in the Sumi region and has recaptured a third of the occupied territories. All the latest news from the front right now. The Russians made a sudden breakthrough on the front ahead of the Putin-Trump meeting. This was reported by the Wall Street Journal. The occupiers found a gap in the Ukrainian defenses and then used their massive manpower reserves to break through. This concerns the salient in the direction of Dobropilya in the Donetsk region.
Now, naturally, Russian troops will try to take advantage of this moment, will try to consolidate their positions, send in additional reinforcements, more troops, and possibly even equipment. And right now, probably in the next few days, the Ukrainian armed forces have a chance to somehow contain this breakthrough. They're, for example, to cut off these breakthrough units by liberating the territory at the very base of this breach. Or to start attacking from different directions and capture, say, all the villages, all the settlements along the way, so that there is nowhere for them to hide and so on.
At the same time, military analysts report that the Russian Federation does not control the entire territory that the assault troops managed to pass through. Most likely during the breakthrough, they were moving in light vehicles, and at this point it cannot be said that the enemy has managed to gain a foothold and take control of the entire salient.
For now, there are only sabotage and reconnaissance groups there. These are irregular troops. These groups are dangerous because they are mobile. They will try to seize vehicles in order to infiltrate further. But it should also be remembered that Russian forces constantly use this tactic of small groups to accumulate at certain lines and then advance further.
The Ukrainian command has already responded to the Russian breakthrough. It is reported that the most combat-ready units of the National Guard, specifically from the Azov battalion, have been redeployed to this direction as reinforcements. Those very same small assault groups have already felt this impact in full.
They wanted to go in as groups but got hit hard. Now we still can't get back out.
Also commenting on the situation, the spokesperson for the Dnipro troop grouping confirmed the Russians' local success, but noted that it involved about a dozen soldiers who managed to slip through the line of demarcation and were pinned down in combat where they ended up.
It's not about them taking control of this territory. What actually happened is that a small number of Russians, between 5 and 10 people, managed to get through. And it's absolutely not how it looks on the map. It's not that they took control of the entire route they traveled. They made their way through and tried to hide in a basement.
At the same time, experts note that Pokrovsk itself, the city that all these encirclement attempts are aimed at, and which is located somewhat south of the breakthrough site, continues to hold its ground quite confidently despite constant heavy assaults.
Overall, if it weren't for this very breakthrough near Dobropilya right now, I would say that over the past 2 weeks the situation has somewhat stabilized. That is, the Russian forces had been acting actively up until then, but at Rodinsky they really hit a serious obstacle. And for a couple of weeks now there have been heavy battles there, but they haven't been able to advance. So basically the defense of this particular semicircular salient is holding quite confidently, I would cautiously say, from the perspective of the Ukrainian armed forces. Of course, these are heavy battles. As I already mentioned, there are a lot of Russian forces there. They are constantly attacking, but nevertheless, we don't see any kind of collapse or crisis.
The situation is also tense north of Pokrovsk. There, the Russians have become active again in the Lyman direction. However, after several days of intensified attacks, apart from dozens of killed assault troops, Russia has gained nothing here.
Right now, we are currently observing a significant and increased movement within the specific area of the Serebryansky forest, more precisely, the forestry region. Essentially, this ongoing activity represents a strategic attempt to advance further south in the direction of Slovyansk, a key objective in their current operational plans. Will the enemy succeed in this? Will our forces find the necessary reserves? Well, I don't know. In principle, we possess formidable forces that are capable of effectively holding back the enemy's relentless advance.
Monitoring channels are also reporting Russian activity in Crimea. Equipment is currently being transferred there from the Moscow and Leningrad military districts, with the possibility of further deployment to the Zaporizhzhia direction or near Pokrovsk. However, in recent months, for Russia, using armored vehicles in assaults has become a major luxury, so the entire operation could turn out to be just a bluff.
Some of the equipment is more or less available, meaning it can even be moved back and forth just to distract attention. We can't rule out that possibility either. At the moment, yes, the Russian forces haven't set any particularly difficult tasks for the Ukrainian armed forces, specifically on the Zaporizhzhia front in the Zaporizhzhia region. That is, yes, there have been some local attacks there. Maybe they'll try to create some more serious tension, including to force reserves to be redeployed from the Pokrovsk direction, so that there simply aren't enough forces everywhere.
But on the Sumi direction, it's the Russians who don't have enough forces. According to President Volodymyr Zelensky, in the Sumi region, the Ukrainian armed forces managed to retake a third of all the settlements that had been captured. That's 6 out of 18. In 2 locations, according to Zelensky, the defense forces even reached the border with Russia.
They can't even properly hold on to these territories. It's not the first village already. Some have been cleared, some have been liberated. Yes, 2 settlements have been freed, and now fighting is still ongoing for Alexeyevka. So the Ukrainian military is gradually, of course, within their means. It's clear they don't have a large number of reserves, but nevertheless, they are reducing this bridgehead. It's not expanding, on the contrary, it's gradually shrinking. All of this is because, for example, during the invasion of the Sumi region, Russian troops are not using heavy equipment, which makes it much harder for them to defend.
The defense forces are also holding their positions in the Zaporizhzhia region and have advanced 1 kilometer deep into enemy positions in Luhansk.
Urgent! Putin's disgraceful failure. In 1,010 days of war, the occupying army has captured less than 1% of Ukrainian territory. This completely shatters the Kremlin's claims of major successes. This is a historic fiasco. Why is Putin's army paralyzed, and what does this mean for Russia's future? Watch. Armata. Day 1273 of the large-scale Russian-Ukrainian war. Almost 3.5 years of daily battles, artillery shelling, drone attacks, and thousands dead. But the result, if you look at the battle map, speaks for itself. Moscow, which shouted about taking Kiev in 72 hours, has, after 1,010 days of bloody fighting, captured less than 1% of Ukrainian territory. These are the conclusions reached by deep state analysts.
Starting from November 12, 2022, as of that date, 108,651 square kilometers were occupied. To this day, it is 114,493 square kilometers. The enemy has occupied 5,942 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory. This amounts to 0.96% of the total area of the Ukrainian state within its internationally recognized borders. Deep state.
The Russians did indeed achieve significant operational successes, but that was in the first weeks of the invasion, when Ukraine was physically unprepared to face what was once considered the world's second strongest army, which was advancing simultaneously in all directions. In those days, the enemy managed to capture Kherson, Mariupol, and parts of the Kyiv, Chernihiv, and Sumi regions.
Everyone realized that they needed to start digging in immediately. At the very least, after losing the Kharkiv region, the Russian Federation clearly understood that it couldn't secure victory on the move, at least not from their side. If you want to hold your ground, you have to dig in. And all this digging in, all these positions, they leveled out the major problems that existed at the start of the war. At first, Russia broke through our defenses in a massive way. Then Ukraine pushed the Russian Federation back, and after that, everyone shifted to more or less positional fighting. Dugouts, trenches, forests, tree lines. And that's how the fighting is conducted.
But subsequent counteroffensives by the Ukrainian armed forces pushed the occupiers back by dozens of kilometers, turning the tide of the war. Since November 12, 2022, the front has stabilized. Russia is still trying to advance now, but not on such a large scale. The enemy is storming the positions of the Ukrainian armed forces, hoping to seize at least a little bit of Ukrainian land. Bakhmut, Avdiivka, Kupiansk, Chasiv Yar, Robotin, Thousands of attempts to storm the trenches, but the advances are minimal, sometimes 300, sometimes 500 meters. Hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers have been lost, but the strategic picture has hardly changed. Now the enemy is conducting mainly local offensive actions, applying pressure, wearing down, destroying infantry and equipment. However, the Russian dictator is unable to seize significant territories.
Despite those losses, and his losses keep growing, every kilometer and every position he captures costs him more and more killed and wounded each time. The statistics bear this out. First, their rate of advance has slowed down significantly. Second, their level of losses is extremely high. Yet they persistently try to achieve the goals they have set for themselves.
They lack resources, they lack strength, they lack capabilities. All those things they boasted about so much before the war turned out to be nothing. Why has a wave of generals being dismissed started in the Russian Federation? This is dictator Putin's personal revenge against all the military generals who, for many years, convinced him that our weapons have no equal, that everything is prepared, everything is great. But as it turned out of this entire million strong army, only about 170,000 people were actually ready to fight at the very start of the war. That's it. None of the others were ready. There was no proper communication, no equipment, not enough ammunition, none of that was there. Everything had been sold off, everything had been stolen. And now this massive revenge, this huge punitive machine that is punishing the generals for this deception, once again shows that the Russian military machine, in reality, is basically just a puff of smoke. Yes, there are people, yes, there are determined allies, Iran, North Korea. But the Russian Federation itself cannot handle Ukraine.
Ukraine is already definitely the winner in this war. Even under conditions of shell shortages and the aggressor country's superiority in manpower and aviation, Ukrainian defense remains resilient. The successes of the Russians remain far less than what Kremlin propagandists claim. Their soldiers are being destroyed on the front by the tens of thousands. Their equipment burns on the battlefields, and the goals of the aggressor's army collapse under the blows of the Ukrainian army. That's all for now. For more breaking news from the front, tune in to the next episode.